Let's pick up where we left off. In the last session, Denise, you gave us a lot more details on how scholars put together the pieces of the puzzle to reconstruct an accurate and faithful Bible. You also shared some of the complications with that process. When you have thousands of manuscripts, there are going to be some contradictions between them. But as it turns out, 90% of those contradictions are single letters, dots on a page, or misspellings. For the rest, we have a reliable process called textual criticism, which allows scholars to find the exact wording that most likely appeared in the original writing.
We concluded that the final product is extremely accurate. In fact, the number you gave us was that by the most liberal estimates, our modern Bible is at least 99.5% accurate to the original. I think we need to talk about that other 0.5%. And to show everybody what I'm talking about, I'm going to read an editorial comment from my Bible in Mark chapter 16. The earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 through 20. When someone comes across a footnote like this, it can be really alarming to think that the Bible does, in fact, have additions that were made over time. Can you walk us through these so-called additions?
The first thing I'll say is you're right, Mackenzie. This could definitely be alarming to readers at home who come across a comment like this, especially if they have friends or family who have brought up the question of falsification in the Bible before. So I think the best place to start is by addressing some misconceptions. There are a lot of uninformed articles floating around on the internet about how there's proof the Bible's been added to. Some other articles make claims like modern translations are taking verses out of the Bible. These kinds of claims are being made by both Christians and non-Christians. It gives the feeling that there could be mysterious verses in Scripture that were never really there. How much of it can we trust? Or on the other hand, are precious verses being taken out to advance some hidden agenda?
So, how do we clear up these misconceptions? What's the full story?
The first thing we need to know is how many of these examples there are. In fact, we can count the number of significant additions on one hand. There's the example Mackenzie just read, which is a reference to the last 12 verses of Mark 16. This section is commonly called the long ending of Mark. And then there's the story of a woman who was caught in the act of adultery and Jesus' compassionate response to her. This is in John chapter 7 and 8. For some reason, scholars gave that passage a fancy title, called the Pericope Adulterae. Lastly, there are a couple of single verses, the longest of which occurs in 1 John 5:7. That one is called the Comma Johanneum. The point is that this isn't an indeterminately long list. There's no need to doubt if what you're reading is true. We know exactly which passages are suspect.
So, we actually know exactly what passages may have been added to the Bible, and it's very few of them. What else do we need to know to clear up these misconceptions?
The second and last important detail is when these additions took place. Again, there's a misconception that this is an ongoing process. The Bible is being doctored, and that we should only be reading the oldest Bibles because the new ones might be different. These additions were made a long, long time ago. So long ago, in fact, that they were already there when the Bible was first translated into English. They were likely made in the first few centuries when more and more manuscripts were being copied.
So the additions are a very short list and were made early on. That's already really helpful in building confidence. But you also mentioned the claim that more verses are currently being taken out of the Bible. Can you address those concerns for us?
That one is easily addressed because this is actually two sides of the same coin. The reason newer Bible translations are missing some verses is because scholars discovered those verses were additions. An example of this is Acts 8:37. Another is Matthew 18:11. If you pick any Bible translation from the 15 or 1600s, it will include those verses, but almost any translation from the last century will omit them. However, they almost always leave a footnote making the reader aware of the change.
You mentioned that the oldest English versions of the Bible were unaware that these passages were additions. How did we just find out about them? And how likely is it that there's more waiting to be found?
Well, in the world of biblical scholarship, it's fairly recent. But in today's information age, these are practically ancient, well-established discoveries. There are nearly 6,000 manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, with almost another 20,000 manuscripts in other languages. But the majority of these were discovered in just the last 2 centuries. the amount of writing we had to work with increased by an order of magnitude. These were earlier, better, more complete manuscripts than ever before. One example is Codex Sinaiticus, which was an entire Bible from the 300s that was discovered in the 1800s. And lastly, the process of textual criticism became much better, more cooperative, and transparent since 1500. As for the possibility of other additions in the Bible that we don't know about, it's highly unlikely. Our discovery of ancient manuscripts is slowing down. But even if we found a new library of them tomorrow, it probably wouldn't make a big impact, considering we already have enough manuscripts to write the Bible many times over.
I think it could still be a little unsettling to know that the Bible has additions in it, even though we know exactly where and how many there are. Walk us through the thought process that leads scholars to keep these additions in the Bible.
There are a few reasons, so let me go through each of them. The first is honesty. The process of reconstructing the Bible and translating it has been 100% transparent for the last 500 years. If scholars kept verses in but didn't mention they were additions, it would be dishonest. And alternatively, if they took them out but didn't explain the reasoning, that would be dishonest too. So scholars have opted for the middle ground, even though it still leaves room for misconceptions. The second reason is that textual criticism is not a pure science. It leads us to the most plausible choice of the original text. And again, most of the time, there is an exceptionally high degree of certainty as to which one is the original version. That's why scholars don't even say this passage is an addition to the Bible. Instead, they'll say something like, the earliest manuscripts or most manuscripts do not include this verse, so they're leaving the final choice up to the reader. The third and final reason is this: it is not the scholar's responsibility to decide what is profitable. The philosophy in textual criticism has always been to leave that to the reader. In other words, perhaps we can still learn something important from Mark 16 or John 8. That is for us to decide. But we just need to know the difficulties around those passages before we make that decision.
And by the way, that's really the whole spirit behind this first course, Can I Trust the Bible? Our role as instructors is to give a fair look at each of these topics and allow people to come to their own conclusions about whether it can be trusted. In the next session, we'll wrap up this module by looking at contradictions in the Bible, whether there are any and how Christians should understand them.